Hello, welcome to the Horticulturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan. And we post a video every week on a Friday. So don't forget to subscribe, press the alert button and come along on our journey.
And if you have a burning question for him, do put it in the comments below. And Stephen and I, well, I won't, I'll read them out. We'll answer them in our Monday shorts. But do say where you're from in the world. It does help contextualize the answer.
It certainly does.
And also, if you're triggered horticulturally by this video, you might want to consider joining the Royal Horticultural Society of Victoria, or in fact, wherever you are.
Yes.
And we'll put the link below. I do hear the patron in Victoria is tricky.
Yes. Interesting character, though. Me.
Stephen Ryan. Anyway, Stephen, talking of all things botanic, horticultural and curious, we're kind of in a bit of a subtropical moment in your garden.
Yes.
Where are we going
Not
today?
feeling subtropical, I might add. All right, we're off to a wonderful island group in the middle of the Atlantic called the Azores.
Oh, another island group. And again, as a child, I just found islands so romantic and wonderful. What's special about... Well, first of all, where is it?
All right, the Azores are out in the Atlantic, even further away from mainland Europe than Madeira. They're a group of 9 islands. We managed to visit 5 of them on the trip, which was very exciting. And they're very damp, moist, green islands. So there's lots of rain, lots of water everywhere, and oodles of greenery.
But now, you say it's moist and it's green and it's lush, because in our last ASA tour video to Madeira, that island immediately looks the same. It's very moist, it's very green, very lush. But your point there was actually it has a very low rainfall, but this capacity to capture water. Whereas the Azores, it's just rain.
They get lots of rain. And so you can almost bank on being wet at some stage or another on a tour to the Azores. And they have some of the similar problems that they have in Madeira, in that there's lots of feral species that have gone nuts. And one of the most interesting feral species there, believe it or not, is the hydrangea.
Oh.
All along the sides of the road, they planted hydrangeas to help with erosion control. And the hydrangeas are just... they just keep growing. Every bit that hits the ground takes root and another hydrangea starts. So they're everywhere.
Okay, where are hydrangeas from?
They're Asian and, well, there's some North American species, but the ones that are in the Azores are actually of Asian extraction.
So it's the classic garden hydrangea. Oh, how funny. But look, before we go any further, though, we should just say, why were you there, Stephen Ryan?
All right. Well, connected with the Madeiran trip, we did Madeira for about a week and a half, and then another 2 weeks travelling around the Azores. And again, mainly to see native plants and wild things and the amazing scenery, because those volcanic islands with their crater lakes and amazing sort of geological formations are just truly remarkable. So it was all part of the one tour.
So in other tours that we've done videos with, it's been very much a garden focus. I mean, sometimes collectors' gardens, so amazing variety of plants. But this is really about wild plants or feral plants in the wild.
Yes, basically. The Azores don't have huge populations. I mean, some of the islands have only got 4,000 people living on them. So you're talking about low population density. So it's about agriculture mainly as far as the local people are concerned. Tourism hasn't taken off in the Azores quite as much as it has on Madeira, but it is certainly building a little bit of a tourist infrastructure. And there are some really beautiful places to stay and be, as well as looking at the fabulous plants.
And is it still part of Portugal?
Yes, it's still part of Portugal and was settled in the 1400s at around about the same time as Madeira was. And of course, none of those islands had a native population.
So is it fair to say that climatically it's similar to Madeira? And like many of these islands, does it have a vast amount, I would imagine, being isolated, of endemic species?
All right. Well, it does have temperatures and things that are not dissimilar to those in Madeira. So it never gets particularly cold, never gets really hot, just has more rain, basically. It has a lot of the same feral species that have taken off in Madeira. So Australian eucalypts, phytosporum, all those sorts of things are a major issue there.
Yeah.
And there is an interesting endemic flora there. So there are plants that grow only in the Azores and not in Madeira. So there's a whole range of plants from there. And I have to say, after spending several weeks wandering around the Azores, if you're not quite sure what its species name might be, it could well be Azorica.
Azorica,
Yeah.
or as it is like Canariensis,
Yes,
or
yeah.
those other.
Yeah. Yeah, so the botanists do make use of the fact that this plant only grows there, so why not call it Azorica? And there's oodles of plants that have that in their name. So I think I could learn the flora there quite quickly.
So what are we looking at here, Stephen?
All right, well, if you go to the island of Flores, and I would definitely recommend it, it is absolutely stunning, there's really only one place to stay. And it's a really interesting accommodation setup in that it's a group of cottages that was in fact originally a little rural village. And some very entrepreneurial people managed to purchase all the cottages over a period of time, and they've turned it into, I guess, an accommodation resort. So they've fixed up the cottages. So internally they've got all of the mod cons that you could possibly need, but externally they look exactly as they would have done 150, 200 years ago, with their little tiny fields all rock wall edged with ponies and other things in the fields. And so you have your own little cottage to live in whilst you're there, and you have to hobble up these rocky paths that are the only real threat to your life and limb there, because in the semi-dark in the evening, it can be quite an interesting challenge to get from the dining room to your cottage.
I mean, the landscape just seems riddled with waterfalls, these incredible cascades that you're showing us.
And in fact, it is one of those places, because of its high rainfall and its very steep volcanic mountainsides, because all of the islands are geologically comparatively new, so they haven't worn away yet. And so the place has masses and masses of waterfalls, streams. None of the islands are big enough to have rivers, but there's masses and masses of streams going everywhere. And yes, you seem to be hearing water wherever you go.
Yes, which we can actually now.
Yes, my pond is making
just
gurgly noises.
Not quite the same though,
No,
Stephen.
no, not quite the same.
All right, so where are we now?
All right, well, we're on San Miguel, which is one of the other islands of the Azores.
Yes.
And we're staying in the most fabulous hotel, the Terra Nostra. And originally it was a property owned by the Blandy family, who were the big entrepreneurs around the islands. And it was a private garden. They've built a big hotel there. The original house is still there. This garden goes on forever, and it is truly a botanic garden with lots and lots of different collections within the garden, and again, water everywhere. So I guess one of the prime things of interest is, in fact, there's some ponds that are fed with tepid water, so it's not cold, and it's the only place apparently that's considered to be part of Europe where they can grow the giant Amazonian water lilies outside.
So these square ponds that we're looking at now, that is the water lily ponds.
Yes.
Just for those water lilies.
Yeah.
And so the water that we're seeing running off into the canal, that's sort of warmer, hydrothermal, whatever the word is, naturally warm water from aquifer.
Yes, and in fact all around this area, Flores is the name of the town, village, whatever that we're in, it has all sorts of geothermal things going off. So there's areas that smell of sulfur, which is not the most pleasant of smells, and there's sort of steam erupting out of the ground, and there's some areas where there's quite hot water and other areas where it's cooler. So it's a very sort of Rotorua-y type thing if you happen to be in New Zealand.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously parts of New Zealand have that very similar geology in terms of the water. So it's a small island. Does that then affect the microclimate of the island, that there's all this sort of volcanic heat quite close to the surface?
I don't think it does, particularly because it's only really obvious in a comparatively small area where it actually does come to the surface.
Right.
So there's only a couple of areas on the island where you can see this happening. There's this area where we are in Flores, and there's also another area around the other side of the lake where they actually sink containers into the ground full of meat and vegetables, and they cook
Make a stew.
They make a stew by the thermal heat coming up from below.
There you go.
So
there's a niche cooking program.
Well, there is, yes.
Geothermal cooking with Steve and Ryan.
Yes, we could try that and see where we go. So this garden, though, has amazing plant collections. The head gardener and his daughter have been running it for donkey's years, and they've got collections of cycads.
Which looks stunning. And again, so the maximum, it doesn't get too hot there.
No.
So again, I'm surprised that cycads are so happy because often, well, I mean, they come from all sorts of places,
Yeah.
but they often do like a warmer, hotter,
Yes,
either
yeah.
tropical or arid climate.
Yeah, and yet they seem to be doing perfectly well there. I love the fact that they're nodding to the Azoran flora as well, because they've got an area where they've got a collection of plants that they've tried to put together of endemic plants from the Azoran Islands, which includes this amazing dockweed, funnily enough called Rumex azorica, and its leaves are about 1 metre long, and it grows up to about 1.5 metres, 2 metres tall. It's got to be one of the most statuesque of the dock plants. I mean, they're generally considered to be rather unattractive, humble weeds. But Rumex azorica did blow me away. I thought that's a plant that I could actually see having garden context.
Well, I guess like many of them, and as we said in the Madeiran video too, I guess your juices were flowing, seeing all these things, but basically impossible to import to Australia.
Yes. If I tried to bring in officially dockweed seed, whether it came from the Azores or not.
And was the size of the Titanic, it wouldn't matter.
No, that's right, exactly. The biosecurity people would be down on me like a ton of bricks. So, yes, there'd be no point, but it is a really pretty plant. And so whilst we were there, we got to see a whole range of interesting trees. A lot of the trees dated back a couple of 100 years. Lots of palms, lots of ferns.
And again, ferns, tree ferns. So is it similar to Madeira that the tree fern, the Australian slim tree fern, has gone wild?
Yes, in fact, it's probably on some of the Azorian islands has actually taken off even more so because they've got even more water. One could say that it is actually slightly pesky, albeit exquisitely beautiful.
Well, not funny, but how it's just extraordinary, isn't it? That all of this species spreading that's happened in the last couple of centuries. I mean, it's happened since humans began canoeing around and traveling around, but there's been a real, like the last 200 years of mass travel.
Yeah.
Plants are everywhere.
Yep, they are. And in some cases, they've turned out to be benign, and other cases, they've turned out to be a nightmare.
Yeah, and certainly there to stay. If only we could come back in 1 million years and see how all this has evolved and changed.
Yes, how evolution would work after what we've done to tamper with the environment. So
there's a lot of feral cats in Australia, and I'm convinced in 1 million years we'll have massive tigers and lions in this country. Anyway,
all right,
moving on. Okay, so you plant nerded out.
Yeah, I did.
The Azores.
Oh, yes.
Tell us. Let's go through your hit list of fabulous things.
All right. Well, there were a number of plants that I was blown away by because I didn't know that species existed. And there's a local Viburnum that comes from the Azores, and I think grows on most of the islands. And that's Viburnum treleasei, and it looks a bit like a common viburnum we have here, Viburnum tinus, which is almost passé. It's just everywhere and boring. But nonetheless, this one was rather interesting and I thought well worthwhile looking at. And again, could make quite a good garden plant.
On that note, we are in the middle of filming a Viburnum epic, actually, FYI. We're just filming different ones at different points of the year.
Exactly.
So we'll refer to that one again.
Yeah, well, why not indeed? And another group of plants that I grow a number of, but that you don't see all that often in Australia. Again, because some species are weedy, others have good garden potential. And one I saw in the Azores, which I thought was rather interesting, was in fact Hypericum glandulosa, a small shrub with little bright yellow flowers. Definitely another plant worth having. So that would be a nice one to import if we could get it. But I have to say, there's one plant that is in Australia, albeit tenuously, and I must try and re-get it again because I haven't had it for some years. But there's a heath called Daboecia azorica, which is a tiny little mat-forming erica relative with inflated purple flowers on it and only grows a few centimetres tall. The flowers are quite large for the size of the plant, so it has quite good garden potential. And there's only 2 species as far as I know in the genus, Cantabrica, which grows in Ireland and southern parts of Europe, and Azorica that grows on the Azores. So, and Azorica is the smaller of the species with the strongest coloured flower.
So
We're looking at a designed garden, which is one of the few we came across that was a modern interpretation of some of the things that were happening. They used a lot of stone walling, which you see all over the place, terrace work and all that sort of thing. So it's part of the normal ethos. They used canals of water, and this garden was several acres, beautiful garden, modern interpretation, and it was actually designed by a Belgian landscape designer, Eric Dont. It was just fabulous. So the owner was very gracious, showed us around the garden, explained what he was trying to evoke, tying in with the landscape outside, so bringing that into the garden. But interestingly, it wasn't a native plant garden specifically. So a lot of the plant material that was used were exotic plants from all over.
You can see pandanus, which I'm surprised at growing there, because
It does go to show just how mild the climate is, sort of subtropical, albeit it doesn't get sort of monsoonal rains and things. And plants from all over are growing there. Some of the major trees are New Zealand Christmas bush, Medrasidras.
and I can see Norfolk Island pine.
Yeah, Norfolk Island
Now,
pines are
actually,
going there.
would Norfolk Island have a similar climate?
Quite possibly. I think it would be a rather similar climate. It's out in the ocean, it wouldn't get cold, it wouldn't get overly hot, and it would have enough moisture to maintain a flora. All right, well, we did a video, or we've done several videos actually, on the genus Euphorbia over a period of time.
We've done tropical, well, arid ones with Lyle
Yes.
at Romana, and we've done
Sort of more garden shrubby ones.
and the bigger ones that are in your garden.
Yes,
here.
I've got
I
a
don't know
couple
if
of-
that was too. Anyway, I'll put a Euphorbia link.
Yes, all right. Well, we also saw euphorbias in the Azores and in Madeira. So there are native species that come from that part of the world as well. Stygiana, Euphorbia stygiana, is a very handsome plant with bold foliage, slightly shrubby one up to about 1.5 meters, which was quite attractive.
Is that here?
I haven't come across it, but I would be surprised if it hasn't found its way in at some stage, because it certainly has got quite a bit of garden potential. So well worth looking out for. And it was funny to wander the forests of the Azores, and I have to say you can do the same thing in the Canaries and you can do the same thing in Madeira, to find native species of ivy. Now, there's Hedera canariensis, there's Hedera azorica, of course, and they're all different species, but have a similar look to them to what classical European ivy has. And of course, when you know ivy to be somewhat weedy in a country where it's not native, you sort of look at it in another place and then you have to rethink things and you say, well, hold on. It's not a weed here. It's actually a native plant doing its native thing. And so it's part of the environment there. And I have to say, I've grown Hedera canariensis over the years from the Canary Islands, and it doesn't seem to have, it's quite a vigorous ground cover or climber, but it doesn't seem to have the weedy potential that Hedera helix, the European ivy, has. And so maybe azorica, which I don't know whether it's here or not, would also make a quite good garden plant with far less weedy potential. So nice plant and very handsome foliage.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Well, Stephen, what more plant nerdiness do we have?
Well, I have to say, one of the plants I wanted to see when I was in the Azores, and I was assured wasn't in flower at that time of the year, was a campanula relative. In fact, it used to be included in campanula. It was called Campanula Vidalii. It's been taken out of the campanula genus and put in one on its own, and it's now called Azorina Vidalii. So it got the same species name, and they still got away with using Azor, except they used it in the genus instead of the species name. It is this beautiful subshrub. It grows probably to about 0.5 metre tall. It has quite thick fleshy leaves, tends to grow in coastal areas around the Azores, in amongst rocks and things, quite hostile conditions actually. And it sends up spikes of these thick textured waxy pink bells. And so of course I'd been told I wasn't likely to see them, and so that was a red rag to the bull, so to speak. And so I spent quite a lot of time finding non-flowering plants, only to find on Flores we actually found one in bloom. I have to say the excitement of seeing one pink bloom was not commensurate from the respect of the other tour participants. They all looked at me slightly strangely when I got quite excited seeing this thing in flower. And it is in Australia. I have grown it. I'd like to try growing it again.
I think
It's a
I've
lovely
got
plant.
one, actually.
Well, you could have. It's one of those plants that does find its way around a little bit through some of the rare plant fairs and things.
Yes, the Yarra Valley Plant Fair, which we've made a video about, and I think young Ben sold me one.
Yes, he could well have done. And what you need is not only to have Azorina Vidalii, but also have it in its white form. So it exists. But there you go. Now, the other one I wanted to talk about, which is a plant we saw both on Madeira and in the Azores, so it's native to both sets of islands, was a giant ranunculus. And it was just stunning. Ranunculus cortusifolia, big yellow buttercup type flowers, and these huge, big, almost water lily shaped leaves with slightly serrated edges. And it grew mainly in really damp to soggy, boggy sort of spots. So those islands were perfect for it. And you'd see it just happily growing along the sides of the roads and in around the edges of the streams and things, and it was just a massive yellow at the moment, looking gorgeous.
Is that in cultivation? Have you seen that anywhere, or in Europe?
I had it very, 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 very shortly in my collection for, sort of a few months, and it was gone. So it has made its way into Australia. Whether anybody's still growing it, I don't know, but it would only be in really cool, damp climates that you could grow it. So as beautiful as it is, it's probably got very little garden context, unfortunately. Now, I was walking along a street on the edge of the ocean with our local guide.
Minding your own business.
Well, no, botanising, as you do.
Yes.
And I saw a little bit of Solidago, goldenrod, growing. And initially I didn't pay any attention. I thought, oh, a weed from North America. But in fact, it was a semi-dwarf variety. It only grew to probably about 1/2 metre tall at most, with the classical yellow goldenrod flowers on it. And it was a local endemic species. Funnily enough, Solidago azorica, like so many of these things. So it's interesting how one's perception of a plant will suddenly change from, oh, that thing, to, oh, look, we've found an endemic.
And I must say, the arrangement of the flowers looks slightly different. And given that it's not as tall, I would have imagined it would be incredibly useful in horticulture.
Oh, it could be a good garden.
Just because of its height versus the other much more common one.
So I think it's a rather handsome plant. So I don't know that it's in cultivation anywhere, but it could be worthwhile having. Now, while I was there, I did ask one of our local guides whether there was something endemic and rare and something that we should be looking for.
Yeah.
It's always a good idea to ask the locals.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, I can take you to a site where we might see in flower a local endemic species, I think only endemic on the western part of the Azores, so the 2 islands which includes Flores, and it's a Veronica dabneyi, and it was thought to be extinct on Flores until comparatively recently, and they found a little colony of it growing on a roadside cutting, believe it or not.
Good for it.
And so we did an unscheduled stop, as you do.
So again, your guests on the tour were thrilled with your roadside stop.
Well, they all enjoy getting out and having a look, but sometimes when you find a plant like this, I mean, the image of it that we're showing you could lead you to believe it's quite spectacular and showy. It's actually a tiny little plant that only grows a few centimetres tall. The flowers are quite tiny, about the size of a forget-me-not flower, or maybe a little bit bigger, but certainly not an overly spectacular plant. It didn't have a lot of flowers on it, but I was standing in front of something that had been thought to be extinct. So, of course, it's exciting. Just the pure fact that you're standing in front of such a rare and unknown plant.
Which brings us finally to one of your many obsessions, subtropical blueberries, Stephen.
Yes. Well, Madeira and the Azores have 2-3 different species of blueberries, and the one we saw a lot of on the Azores was Vaccinium cylindricum, which has quite long, narrow flowers on it. Again, they vary from almost white through to quite a deep sort of cherry pink. A large shrub, soft green foliage, apparently attractive and edible berries on it, and it ain't here.
Oh.
So sadly. So yes, the Macaronesian Vacciniums, I think, are a unsung group of plants that would be lovely to have, but we're unlikely to get them here.
Oh, well. Well, Stephen, I've loved this amble through the misty byways of the Azores.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the experience and hope to be going back in a couple of years. So if anybody wants to join me, watch this space.
Yes, so we'll put the link to Australians
studying abroad.
I never get it right. Australians studying abroad. And as we said before, You need be neither Australian nor in Australia to join any of these tours. And there are subject matters from architecture to cooking,
Oh, anything you could possibly want.
arts, all manner of things.
And in fact, we did have a lady from Florida on our Madeira and Azoran trip. So, Maggie, if you're watching, greetings from Australia.
There you go. So we'll put that link below. Now, Stephen, we have wandered the remote isles this week. What could we possibly do next week?
I think we'll do something closer to home.
Okay. And whatever it is, you'll have to find out by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell.
Yes, and don't forget our Monday short. So if you've got a question you want me to answer, pop it in the column below and we'll get round to answering it in due course.
We will indeed. But until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, bye all.